Hello everyone, Mr. Corrigan here. Today's Cristo Rey podcast is a commemoration of the Holocaust. Due to the serious nature of this topic, we have chosen not to begin with the usual theme music, and we will present the entire interview without interruption. Listener discretion is advised. Here are podcast hosts Nija and Emily with an introductory prayer.
Eternal God, creator of the universe, there is no God but you.
Great and wonderful are your works. Wondrous are your ways.
Thank you for the many splendid variety of your creation.
Thank you for the many ways we affirm your presence and purpose, and the freedom to do so.
Forgive our violation of your creation.
Forgive our violence toward each other.
We stand in awe and gratitude for your persistent love for each and all of your children.
Christian, Jew, Muslim, as well as those with other faiths.
Grant to all in our leaders attributes of the strong.
Mutual respect in words and deed.
Restraint in the exercise of power.
And the will for peace with justice. For all,
eternal God, creator of the universe, there is no God but you. Amen.
Thank you, Emily and Nija. And now we'll hand things over to podcast host Jalil to begin.
Hi, guys. This is Jalil, and we're in for a very special and exciting episode. We have a special guest today. Before I get into that, I want to first introduce my co-host, Ujwal.
Hey.
Alanga.
Hey, guys.
Icy.
Hey, guys.
We have a very special guest, Debbie Sugarman. It's a pleasure to have you. For those who don't know, Debbie is the child of a Holocaust survivor, and she's here today. So we're honored to have you, for sure.
I'm honored to be with you.
Thank you. If you don't mind, could you jump into a little bit about, I believe it is your father's story?
My father's name was Morris Dach, D-A-C-H, Dach. And my dad was born in Plońsk, Poland. And Plońsk was like a suburb of Warsaw. When I drove there, it took 45 minutes to get there. So it was close. And that was years ago before the roads were good. And my dad was the youngest of four sons. He was born to Lazar and Devorah Dach. He was the baby, and his brothers were all married and had children. And he had aunts and uncles, and he had cousins. And my father was the only survivor from his entire family. Plońsk, before the war, and it depends on what you read about Plońsk, had anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 Jews. And Plońsk had Jews in the 1600s. It goes back that far. It looks like my relatives were there in the 1800s. They were there a long time. I have somebody in Poland actually researching my family tree because I couldn't find anything. There were 8,000 to 12,000 Jews. After the Holocaust, everybody had gone to Auschwitz. 50 people came back. I mean, that whole Jewish community was just wiped out. So my dad was much younger than his brothers. And the one thing he told me, he would go to school every day, and he'd go to school at the synagogue. There were two huge Orthodox, very synagogues in Plońsk. And he would be walking to school, and the Poles would be screaming, "Dirty Jew," and throwing rocks at the kids and screaming at them and hitting them and getting beaten up every day. And he went home one day, and my grandfather, Lazar, said, "What are you crying about?" He was crying because he was beaten up and called bad names. Grandfather said, "I'm going to give you something to cry about if you don't go and stand up and fight for your rights." So, I mean, anti-Semitism, started, my dad was born in 23, and it started in the early 30s. I mean, Hitler was coming to power, and there were all types of people saying, the Jews need to get out of Poland. You Jews need to get out of Poland, because if not, you're going to get slaughtered. There's a guy in Germany, and he's basically coming to get you. Problem was, nobody wanted us. When you tried to get out, the Americans wouldn't take you, the British wouldn't take you, the French wouldn't take you. Nobody would take them. Hitler said, get out. And there was nowhere to go, which is why Israel's so important to Jews today, because we have to have a homeland. We have to have somewhere that we can call our own if we ever get into the situation. And unfortunately, we're in a bad situation again. My dad went out and he started to protect himself. He'd go to school every day, and things were getting worse in Poland. Food was becoming more scarce. The Nazis had come to power. It was hard to get around. It was hard to even go to school. And, soon the Nazis came into Poland, and they took Poland in the matter of like 3 to 5 days. I mean, Poles didn't have anything to fight with. And, they came in. We had sticks and stones, and they had tanks. And so they took over Poland. And first thing they did was they tried to humiliate people. So the rabbi, he had this really long beard, one of the rabbis. And the religious Jews, the men, wore long beards and black hats. And the Nazis would take them and throw them down on the street. And they'd take knives and they would cut the beards off. And they'd cut it so close that, Dad said blood would be pouring, from the guy. Anything they could do to humiliate people, they did. That was their job, to humiliate and make you feel less than. And then they put the stars on people. So it wasn't just the Jews the Jews got the yellow stars. LGBTQ community, they got stars. The Romas, as you might know, gypsies, they got a different color star. Developmentally disabled. Anybody that Hitler didn't deem good enough to survive, basically, was marked to be destroyed. So there were more Jehovah's Witnesses. There were a lot of righteous Catholics because Poland's a Catholic state. And lots of people that tried to help the Jews and hide the Jews, they ended up with the Jews. And they met the same fate. There were a lot of good people, but there were more bad people. So soon they moved everybody, all the Jewish community, into a small area called the ghetto. And the ghetto had barbed wire around it. And it would be like, you're taking 10, 12,000 people and putting them in part of our convention center. Very crowded. There was no sanitation. There were no indoor toilets back then. People had either outhouses or slop jars in their homes if it was cold in the winter. There was no heat. They had to try to get coal. They had to try to get wood, and all of that was difficult, very difficult to get. When they put the people in the ghetto, they had to wear their stars. They couldn't leave the ghetto unless they were taken out by the Germans or the Poles. People started dying. They got lice, and the lice carried typhus and tuberculosis. Hitler's final solution was to kill everybody, and this is exactly where it began. Every day, my dad said you'd walk out of the little apartment you were in, and you'd have to stack up all the bodies, and then they'd come with wagons because there were no cars there, and they would take the bodies and they'd burn them in mass graves. This was going on, month after month, and they shoot people just in the streets to make an example out of them. You don't do what we tell you to do, and this is how you're going to end up. And one day they came with a large truck, and they took young people, my dad included, and they took them outside of Ploinsk, and they took them into a field, and they had them dig a long, narrow ditch. And when they were done, trucks came in from Ploinsk with people that you knew, you didn't know. The people were lined up at the edge of the ditch. The people that dug the ditches, like my dad, were told to walk away and turn their backs. And the Germans shot the people in the ditches. Well, the problem was they didn't kill everybody. My dad and all these people had to go bury people, and they were still living. And the Germans wouldn't waste another bullet because they were going to die anyways. And when my dad told me the ground was moving as he was burying these people alive, the inhumanity is all I can say. So my dad lived in a town where there was a railroad station. And when you had a railroad station, you got a one-way ticket to a work camp, a death camp, concentration camp. If you did not live by a train station, then you were taken out in killing fields, and people were shot and they were thrown into mass graves and they were burned. But my dad lived, there was a railroad station in Ploinsk. And so they got a one-way ticket to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. And Auschwitz was the largest death camp of any of them. So my grandparents went on the first transport, and that was October 28th, 1942. There were 2,000 people on that transport. My dad and his three brothers walked my grandparents to the train, and my dad handed my grandmother, Devora, a blanket, and she handed it back to my dad and said, "You need this more than me. You're going to be the only one that lives." So my grandparents left. Every 2 weeks, a transport. The second transport, my aunts and my cousins left. The third transport, my two oldest uncles left. And my dad and his brother that was 5 years older, that was the closest in age to him, they left December 16th. It was a 3-day trip to Auschwitz. They were loaded on cattle cars. They were wooden, there were no seats. They were packed in tight. There was no toilet or anything. There was a slop bucket and one bucket with water, and that was for 3 days. And they knew it was 3 days because they could see the dark and the light through the slats in the trains. So when they got to Auschwitz 3 days later, my father said half of the people were dead already because they didn't have anything to exist with. And they brought a little food. They had no idea where they were going. I mean, people had said, "You're not going to a good place," but they really weren't sure where they were, were going to end up. So they had one suitcase with them and a few provisions, but it was too much. I mean, there was not even anywhere you could sit down. They were so packed tight together. So the first thing, when the Germans opened the doors, they wanted everybody to get out of the train. And then you had to unload the bodies and stack them up in front of the train. So they had to do that. And then they were put in a line. And so from the 2,000 people, 1,500 went right to the gas chambers, and 500 were chosen by Dr. Mengele, who did medical experiments at Auschwitz. They called him the Angel of Death. And they were sent to work, which was also going to be to death because they were working them to death. They were taken over, and the first thing they had to do was undress, take all their clothes off. And then my father said they shaved them from head to toe. They didn't want any lice coming in because lice would bring, again, typhus, tuberculosis. That could wipe out their workforce if it came into the camp. So they shaved them from head to toe, and then they put like a disinfectant on them. And he said it just burned like fire because his pores were open. They didn't use shaving cream or anything. They were vicious. And then they gave them striped pajamas and wooden shoes and a little beanie hat. And then they walked him up to a table, and he was given a tattoo. He lost his identity. He became 83988. That was his prisoner number on his arm. And Auschwitz was the only camp that tattooed their prisoners. The rest of the camps did not. So he had 83988 and a triangle, which was half of the Jewish star to show he was Jewish, and his yellow star. So they took him, but it was late. They took him to the barracks. He was in line with a lot of people to go into the barracks. And he asked a guy next to him that he didn't know where the rest of the families went. And the guy pointed to the smokestacks of the crematorium and said, "There's your families. They're going up in smoke. They're being burned." So the people, the 1,500, they went to the gas chambers. So what they did was they told the people to get undressed. They told them to tie their shoes together so they didn't get lost. Stack your belongings, stack your suitcase. Here's a bar of soap. Well, a shower sounded good after 3 days in a train where you had no sanitation. And they put them in, it was a concrete room. They sealed the door, and it was called Zyklon B. The gas came down, and they were asphyxiated. They couldn't open the doors right away because they didn't want to be asphyxiated. The gas had to be aerated. And then the people went in, and they pulled the bodies out. So my dad was part of that platoon for a while. So when they took the bodies out, the first thing they did, we get fillings now and they're white. You can't even tell you've had a filling. They were solid gold back in Poland and Europe. So they looked in everybody's mouth. They pulled out all the gold fillings. So it was melted down. That's what funded the war for Germany. I know. How can you even imagine this? So they did that. They shaved everybody's hair off their heads because the hair was used to stuff pillows and mattresses because the Germans needed to be comfortable. And, everything was sent back to Germany. So the other thing they did, so the women, they sewed, if they had some coins or a wedding band that was gold, they would sew that into like the cuffs of men's pants. They'd make false pockets. They'd sew it into the hems of their skirts. So they had to go through all of the clothes and look for anything that might be hidden. They had to go through all of the suitcases. Like Friday night, we light Sabbath candles. We welcome Shabbat, our Sabbath, Friday night sundown to Saturday sundown. So most people had silver candlesticks, and they brought them with them because this is what was important to them. Their religion. They died because they were Jewish. Mm-hmm. So, they took the candlesticks, they melted the silver down. This was all very valuable. And the shoes were sent back. So that's what they had to do. And then they had to pile the people up, and then they were taken with a cart to the crematoriums, and they were burned. And eventually the crematoriums couldn't keep up, and they just did the mass graves and burned people in mass graves. So, and a lot of people that were just put in gas vans because they didn't have enough capacity. So they would put them in trucks, and they would put the carbon monoxide back into the back of the truck, and they died that way. They gassed them, and then they were put into mass graves and burned. So they didn't feel that any of us were worthy of life.
Yeah, I'm in shock. Definitely hearing from this. This is such a woebegone tragedy of history,
Yeah, and to think I don't even have pictures of the people my dad talked about, the family.
Yeah.
I don't know what
ancestry.
Yeah, who do I look like?
Right. Yeah.
Like my grandfather? I don't know.
Yeah.
I have a picture. Everything was taken. Mm-hmm. Everything was taken from him, and it was taken from me and my children.
Yeah. And those to come.
My dad also, he was sent to bricklaying school, and he learned to lay the bricks to build the crematorium and to build the barracks and to build the gas chambers. So, and I went on the site, and it showed on the Auschwitz site, I could look him up, and it showed that he went to bricklaying school. They kept meticulous records.
Right.
So he and his one brother were both in Birkenau, which Auschwitz had 3 camps. There was Auschwitz 1, Auschwitz to Birkenau, which is a lot of the pictures when you see the railroad tracks going through like a long building with like a hole in the middle. That was Birkenau. That's where the majority of the death camp was. And then there was Auschwitz III, which was called Monowitz or Buna. And then there were a zillion subcamps that they had all around the area. And so my dad and his brother were in Birkenau, and they were building. And then they were sent to Auschwitz III to Buna. And they were sent to work in the Farben plant there, which was a rubber plant. So they get over there and they see somebody from Ploinsk, and the guy said, "Your brothers are here." And so it took my dad and his brother a couple days, and they finally saw the two oldest ones. And typhus broke out, and my dad and the brother he had gone, his name was Shopsa, he had gone to Buna with, they were shipped back to Birkenau. And my oldest uncles were murdered in Monowitz. So they're back there, and my dad was in there for 2 years and 3 months. And he was a tough guy. I don't know how anybody survived, but some of his friends also from Ploinsk survived. They were part of the 50 that came back. So the war was coming to an end, and the Russians were coming upon Auschwitz, all 3 camps. And the Russians and the Germans had a terrible hatred for one another because of World War I. Hitler always said nobody would know what happened in these camps. So the Germans started bombing the crematoriums and trying to get rid of the evidence, and they were bombing some of the barracks. But the Russians were right on them, and they couldn't bomb fast enough, so they ran. And then they took people out on a death march into the forest out of Auschwitz. And my dad was on the death march. And then they left 3,000 people behind that couldn't go on the death march. They were just too physically sick. Well, a couple weeks before the death march, my uncle Shopsa, he got sick, and so he was murdered. So he made it close to the end, but he didn't make it all the way to the end. So my dad goes out on the death march. It's in January of 45. It's freezing cold in Poland. I was there in 84 in June. It was freezing cold, and there's snow. And these people have no coats. They have no boots. The Germans have coats and boots, but nobody has food. Germans have their guns. There's like 30,000 Jews marching through the forest. They're trying to take them to another camp and get away from the Russians. And my dad said that the Germans were dying. I mean, the soldiers, the whole forest was just littered with bodies because nobody had anything. And on the 3rd day, he decided he was going to take a run. And he thought, well, I'm going to die one way or another. They'll shoot me, fine, or they're going to find me, I'll just be a skeleton in the forest. He ran, he didn't tell anybody, and 2 guys ran behind him. So they were wandering for weeks. They had no idea where they were in Poland. They hid in barns. They found a house that was empty. A Polish farmer was at war. The guy finally came back. He said, "I won't turn you in, but you have to leave. I don't want to get killed by the Germans over you being there." And he said he thought they wandered like 3-4 weeks. And finally, he came upon the Russian army. And they liberated them. And they said, "Here's guns, go out and kill Germans." And my father was like, no, I just want to go back to Ploinsk. My dad knew his family was gone. There was no doubt in his mind that nobody was alive. But he wanted to go back and see anyways, and see if any of his friends came back. And so the Germans got him back, or the Russians rather, got him back to Ploinsk. So his house was gone. I mean, it was still there, but the thing that happened was all the Poles looted everything that belonged to the Jews. So they took their homes and they took their belongings. And so my grandparents' house wasn't available, but my dad and his friends forced their way into my dad's uncle's house. So there's a dozen of them in this house, and what are they going to do? Nobody's come back. I mean, what are they going to do? What they've been through? They don't want to stay in Poland, but they don't know where to go. Well, before the war in the 20s, my grandmother, Devora, had a brother. She was one of 8, and she had a brother and a sister, and they left and they went to Boston. So my dad knew that he had family in the United States, but my dad wanted to go to Israel and fight. It wasn't Israel then, it was Palestine. He was trying to get to Palestine. So couldn't do anything about that in Poland. And they're sitting there and there's a knock on the door a couple months later, and it's the Polish army, and they want to draft him into the army. And he said, there is no way this is going to happen, period. And so they went to a displaced persons camp called a DP camp in Germany, in Lundsberg, Germany, outside of Munich. So then the American army talks to my dad, and they said, do you have any relatives anywhere? My dad goes, I want to go to Palestine. I want to fight for Palestine. Okay. Do you have relatives that went to Palestine? I don't know. I want to go to Palestine. Okay. Do you have relatives anywhere? I have an uncle and an aunt in Boston. Okay. We're going to look for them. You've got to go where somebody sponsors you. Well, my uncle, my great uncle, his name was Scheiman. It was Szjei. Anyways, very difficult to spell, Polish spelling. He changed his name to Simon, Simon. They can't find anybody by the name of, Isaac Scheiman. So it took 2 years, and they finally tracked down my great uncle, who was living in Boston. He was married. He had 2 daughters. So he sponsors my dad. So my dad gets on a boat, and he, comes across the ocean, and there are no luxury ships. I mean, they're laying on the floor, and he said everybody was sick and dying on this boat. No stabilizers crossing the Atlantic in March. And my dad pulls into New York Harbor on St. Patrick's Day. There was no St. Patrick's Day in Poland. They had never heard of St. Patrick's Day. They didn't know anything about St. Patrick's Day. And he gets off this train. There's nobody there to get him. And everybody is dressed in green and drinking green beer and eating green donuts. And he thought the world had lost its mind. And I just laugh every St. Patrick's Day. He used to put on a green jacket, and he called it his banana boat day. So he was put on a train and sent to Boston, where he encountered the same green. And because Boston is very Irish Catholic, and they were all there, and everybody was drunk in the streets, and the Boston Harbor was green, and he couldn't figure anything out. And these 2 women came up to him in the train station and asked him in Yiddish, because he couldn't speak English, if he was Moshe. And he said yes, and they were his 2 cousins, and they picked him up and they took him back to the uncle's home. So the uncle had come. He had become very big in politics in Boston and wealthy in real estate. And he had a big home right outside of Boston. And his wife also came from Poland and had brought her whole family, which was fine with her. But she wasn't too excited about having the one living member from her husband's family. And she wasn't very nice. They had plenty of bedrooms. She put a mattress in a closet for my father, and he laid on the floor in the closet. But to him, it was paradise, because look where he was laying. He was laying on pallets with 4 people, in the concentration camp with no blankets or anything. So, I mean, for him, it was okay, and it was family, and he adored the 2 daughters. And, he really didn't remember anything about my great uncle, because they left when my dad was a baby. So, but he had family, so that's all he cared about. So the great aunt said, well, what do we do with him? He has no education. What's he going to do? Well, I'm going to put him to work in a delicatessen. He can sweep floors at night. So that's all she thought my father could do. So my dad went to work. He signed up for English class, and he went to work in this deli, and he swept the floors and he cleaned the place. And then the guy taught him how to make sandwiches and how to cook the corned beef and make the potato salad and soups. And he learned that trade. So my great uncle was doing this project outside of Boston, and there was a young guy he knew that was starting to do real estate. That was like a couple years younger than my dad. And he took this guy, Herb Glimsher, with him to look at this piece of property and see what Herb thought. So he was telling Herb about his nephew, and Herb said, I want to meet this guy. I have to meet your nephew, And so he met my dad, and every day when my dad got off of work in the morning, he picked my dad up, and my dad would come out with a pile of corned beef sandwiches, and he'd help my dad with his English, and my dad would ride. The guy turned out to be my uncle. My uncle sold like windows and aluminum siding and things. They called him a tin man. And so I always say he dated my uncle and he married his sister, my mother. So in November of 1947, my uncle took my father home for Sabbath dinner to my grandmother's house, and my mother walked in. And my mother had 3 younger brothers, and they were married in February. So Mo was a risk taker. I mean, he met somebody and he got married, and she was a bigger risk taker. Yeah. And my grandparents were immigrants from the Ukraine.
Yeah, and I bet going through something so tragic, it makes you not want to, wait on anything in life. You probably makes you want to go.
Wanted a family.
Yeah, I'm glad. Also, you said your grandparents were from Ukraine?
But so my mother's parents, yes. Yeah, my mother was first generation, her parents, my grandparents.
And a little bit back, you touched on Russia and Germany and that whole relationship. So before we jump into like some of the other questions that we had from the students, I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about the relations going on right now between Russia and Ukraine? And because that's such a big current event right now, I'd love to get your perspective, being your story and your family history. I know that this must be hard.
My grandma Glimsher was from Kiev.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And my grandpa Glimsher was from right outside of Kiev, Zhytomyr, and we still have family there. And so my cousin that we brought 3 families from Russia. The first one was 31 years ago, and then 29 years ago, and 28 years ago. And because we couldn't leave them there with the anti-Semitism. So one of my Russian cousins called me and said they bombed Zhytomyr. We know they're in Kiev. And they bombed Babi Yar, which is a Holocaust memorial. They killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people at Babi Yar. And the Russians bombed it.
Wow.
My heart is broken. So I see these kids. I know they're going on a train, not to a death camp, and God willing, they're going to see their fathers again. But when you see these families torn apart, and I know my family's story of, children being torn from mother's arms, and, I'm heartbroken.
Yeah.
I'm heartbroken. I actually had my cousin from outside of Washington, D.C. reach out to me. And before I got online, I reached out to a friend of mine who works with a Jewish agency. And she wants to fly to Poland to help with the refugees. Right. So I'm trying to figure out who she should go through. But
I couldn't imagine what it must be. Do you feel like it's somewhat like reliving or like?
Yes.
It
feels like the 30s and the 40s again.
Yeah, no, for sure. It just now we have technology and we have, of course,
now we see it all.
Yeah, and that's that would can be more traumatic sometimes, Yeah,
it is. But Jaleel, the crazy thing is the world knew what was going on in Europe. They knew about all the camps all over Germany and Poland, and and they turned their back. My dad said that every day planes flew low over Auschwitz, okay?
Right.
And he could see the American flag. He could see the British flag. He could see the French flag, and they took pictures. Everybody knew. Roosevelt knew what was going on, and nobody. If Japan didn't bomb us, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, no, for sure. That is crazy, and it's I'm thankful for social media and the impact that it has on the culture today, because I feel like now you can't turn a blind eye to it. You can't just look away. It's going to be there, and I think that's awesome. We have a question from a freshman named Campbell. She wants to know what's it like being the child of a Holocaust survivor, and were you told many stories as a child, or did you learn about this later in life?
No. So I grew up outside of Boston, 19 miles outside of Boston, in Natick, Massachusetts. And my dad and my mom got married, and they opened a delicatessen, a restaurant in Natick Square. And right down the street was my best friend. Her name was Barbara Burrell. And, none of us thought our fathers had accents, or in some cases, mothers. That's just what they sounded like. So it didn't even occur to any of us. So that wasn't, anything that tipped us off that both of our fathers had accents. But both of our fathers had numbers. So I said to Barbara one day, I said, "What do you think the numbers are?" I was 7 years old. She goes, "My dad told me it was our phone number." I'm a real pain, okay? I gave my parents heartburn because I had to know everything about everything, which is medical field was good for me. And I go down the street and I take a look at my father's arm, and 83988 was not, my number was Longwood 86677. So I knew it wasn't the number. Back up the street I go. I said, "You better check that out. I don't think that's your phone number." So, making trouble, Debbie. So after work or after school every day, we were picked up and we were taken to the deli. I have a brother 2 years younger than me, Larry. And my mom would close the deli in the evening, and my dad, who would get up at 2 a.m. to start cooking and go to work, he would take us home. He'd feed us at like 4 p.m, and he'd fall asleep. And the 2 Dash kids were out to roam the neighborhood. So I said, I have to go to the library. It was across the square. And then kids could walk anywhere. And I went to the library, and I said to the librarian at 7, "If somebody has a number on their arm, do you have a book?" And she gave me a book called Treblinka, which was a death camp. And so I went home, and I didn't let my parents see the book. And I went into my room and I read Treblinka, and I was like, freaked out. They were talking about the gas chambers and everything. 7 years old was a bit young for this. I went back and I got more books. And under my bed, I'm hiding all of these books. And my mother goes in to clean my room because I was a slob, and she finds all these books under the bed. So she doesn't know what to do with me. She didn't know all through growing up. We were very, very close, but she never knew what to do with me. I was my dad's kid. And so she called her mother, and my grandmother gets in the car from Boston and drives out to Natick and comes into my room and pulls the books out. And I come home from school, and my grandmother's sitting there with all these books. And there weren't that many back then on the Holocaust. I mean, because we're talking, like the early 60s. And people didn't talk about it then. Survivors didn't talk about it. So my grandmother goes, "What do you want to know?" Because my grandmother knew the story. And so she started to tell me bits and pieces. I'd figured out already why I didn't have grandparents and uncles that my dad always talked about, and cousins. And so she told me some of it. That was, as tame as she could get, so to speak. And then, and they told my father, but my dad didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to him. And I kept reading because this wasn't going to go away. I had to figure out anything I could. And then my brother was 2 years younger, and I tried to share it with him, and that was Larry. So, and I went up the street and I told Barbara, who said, no, no, no. So I just kept doing my research, and I was 9 or 10, and my father finally sat me down and talked to me. I was afraid to ask, what would I dredge up? Would I hurt him? But it was always with my father. My father had nightmares every night. He would scream. And the Nazis were chasing him. We had billy clubs and baseball bats around the house. My dad didn't believe in guns. He couldn't close his eyes without Auschwitz being there with him till the day he died. So, yeah, that's how I found out. And then I'm trying to think. I would say people started speaking in the late 70s and early 80s. Survivors started telling their stories. Not all of them. I have friends whose parents never talked about anything. They went to their grave and never told their kids. But my dad started speaking, and I'd take him to the schools, and he would speak. And he spoke until the week he died. He was so physically weak. He was in heart failure. And he went to Tiffin, Ohio that Wednesday because he had promised the kids he was coming and the teacher, and he wasn't going to let them down. And he went there on Wednesday. He went back to work on Thursday. On Friday, I took him to the doctor, and he passed on Sunday. My father never missed a day of work. He never missed a commitment, no matter how crummy he felt. And he had a lot of health issues. And a lot of them came from, being starved to death in the concentration camps. I mean, they were given bowls of hot water with potato peels twice a day. That was their food, and a small piece of bread. That was it. So, I think a lot of it was from what he went through, all of his health issues, and all of the survivors that I knew that were in the camps that I grew up with. Nobody lived out, to be really, really old. My dad was 80 when he passed away. So I think he did pretty well considering everything. So that's how I found out. And then when my dad died, he went to schools all over the state, and the schools started calling. He died in June of 2003. So 18 and a half years ago. So in the fall, the schools started calling, and they wanted him to come speak. And the secretary at the business would put me on the phone, and they said, well, you speak. You brought your dad. You can speak. So that's what I've been doing all these years. I can't let them be forgotten.
Yeah, we really appreciate you, reminding us of how lucky we are to not have been in those situations, and to be grateful of the lives that we have, because we're not more special than them. And yeah, it's just nice to remember that there are some people who suffered a lot, and
they suffered because of their religion or their sexual persuasion, or because they were developmentally challenged. I mean, they weren't bad people.
No. Yeah.
You're not a bad person. I'm not a bad person. I don't think I'm a bad person. And, you know, who decides? What kind of lunatic decides that these people don't deserve to live? And there were 6 million Jews that were murdered, but there were 11 to 15 million people murdered in the Holocaust.
That's a lot of people.
That's a staggering number of people.
Yes.
That one person, it took one person with a bad idea. And it's like when I go to schools and I speak, I talk about bullying. You think of Hitler as a bully, and kids that bully, you point to somebody and you say, "Ooh, look at that. They've got purple hair." Okay? "Oh, I don't like people with purple hair." Then you've got 5 people looking at the person with purple hair, or the person that's gay, you know, and all of a sudden they're singled out. Okay. Yeah. And people are prejudiced, and people are anti-Semitic, and people are racist, and people are homophobic and xenophobic, and it's not a nice situation. And I think, you know, it's not a nice situation. And so when people bully, and I try to, with younger kids, relate something that happened 75 years ago that's still going on in various countries today. I mean, Syria has gas chambers and concentration camps too. And you know, I just, you're no better if you bully people.
Yeah.
And you call people out and you single them out. I mean, we should be better than that.
Yes.
We should love each other. There's so much hatred.
No, definitely. I'm so glad you. You can go ahead, Ison.
Miss Sugarman, first of all, I want to take the time to thank you for sharing your story. And I know how sad and how scared you was, but we are grateful that you took the courage to still be here with us and still, explain what happened and share your stories and share the story of your father. We really do appreciate it. I was wondering, as you said that you was a curious kid when you was growing up. So if you think, do you think that if you would have never wondered about the numbers on your father's hand or went to the library and asked about it, do you think that your father would ever had told you what had happened?
Yes, I think he would have when we were older, and he felt like it was a more appropriate time not to scare us to death. Yes, because my dad was a very open person, like me, and so I know he would have told us. And in 1984, I talked my dad into going to Poland, and it was Russia then. It was communist Poland. It was not the Poland of these days. And so we landed in Warsaw, and we spent a couple days in Warsaw, and we went to Plońsk, and people saw my dad and said that he went to school with, "Oh my, you're still alive? How did you live?" And he saw classmates of his, and I don't speak Polish. My brother was with me, and my cousin from New York, and my brothers and my best friend from LA. And we could just tell what was going on. You didn't have to speak Polish. I mean, and then this one woman, she took us to her home, and my dad's best friend was Irving Wasserman in Boston, and he was from Plońsk, and his name was Wassersuk. And she starts bringing out pictures and teacups and a tea set. And I hear Wassersug, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this has to be the stuff from his family's house. So I said to my dad, tell her to give it to us and we'll take it back to Boston. And she wouldn't. She let me take pictures of the pictures of his family, and she wouldn't. That many years later, we're talking 84, she wouldn't give me anything. It was hers now. You know, it was stolen as far as I'm concerned, but it was hers. And so we were there. And then my friend Paul and I, we rented a car and we drove to other concentration camps. My dad and my brother and cousin went back to Points the next day. So we went to Treblinka, and we went to Majdanek, and we went to Sobibor. And what struck me, and this was before we met my dad and the other two at in Krakow, and we went to Auschwitz the next day in Birkenau. And what struck me when I went to Majdanek was I was standing in the center of Lublin, which was it's now a huge town, you know, booming metropolis in Poland. And I'm looking at the railroad tracks, and I'm looking at Majdanek, and I'm standing right there in the center of town. Now, people saw train cars with people going into the concentration camp and nobody coming out. They saw smokestacks. They had to smell the smoke, you know, the burning flesh. You mean to tell me nobody knew what was going on there? No way. No way. Right in the middle of a big city. You know, so you when you see something wrong, you can't turn your back on people. And you can't, you know, you have to be social justice.
Definitely.
You know, we went to Auschwitz, and as he's walking through the gates with me, Arbeit macht frei, work makes freedom. And the enormity of what I had done, taking this man back through the gates of Auschwitz, hit me. But I had to go. I felt like half of me was missing. You know, I had to see Points. I had to see it with my dad. I had to somehow feel, I mean, my family, Auschwitz is a cemetery. That's where they all are. What a trip. My younger son went to Poland on March of the Living when he was a senior in high school, but it wasn't the same as what I experienced. Yeah, they cleaned it up. It looked nice. It's run as a museum. It's a big money maker, and you have to have reservations. We walked in and it was raw.
How do you feel about that? The places that have been renovated and are just being used to gain money.
I'm glad it exists. I'm glad people can go and, you know, see where the inhumanity occurred. They sterilized, I mean, they planted grass, there's trees, they cleaned up the barracks. You know, the pictures that I see now and the pictures that Aaron showed me are not the pictures that I have. You know, now they have uniforms hanging like in wardrobes. They didn't have extra uniforms. What you got when you walked in is what you had. You know, there were no wardrobes. There were no toilets. You know, there were holes cut in concrete. That was it. There were no heaters. And so it paints a little bit different of a picture, but still, you can see where they bombed out, you know, the remnants of the crematorium, and that they can't clean up. And you know, but it's certainly sterilized since I was there.
Miss Sugarman, do you feel like there should have been a greater consequences for these actions that were taken against the Jews? And if you do, like, what type of consequence do you think should have happened?
Well, a lot of the Nazis got away. Okay, they were hidden in South America. They were hidden in the United States. They were hidden all over Europe. And there was quite a few Nazi hunters, but the most well-known is Simon Wiesenthal. There's a Wiesenthal Center, which is a Holocaust memorial in California. And he hunted down Nazis and the Klarsfeld, and these people were brought to trial. But Mengele, they never found. I mean, a lot of them lived a lovely life. Sometimes when people got close, they had to flee, but they were tipped off by, South America. A lot of them were in Argentina and hidden, and they lived their life. But they were living here amongst us. And they are still finding people. And even though they're in their 90s and people say, oh, what are you going to do to a 90-year-old? Ship them back. Ship them back. It doesn't matter to me. They should be held accountable. With their last breath, they should be held accountable. None of us have families. These people, some people say the Holocaust didn't happen. Well, then show me where, 11 to 15 million people disappeared to. Wiped out most of Eastern European Jewry. And there was a lot of culture. It's my job. I have 2 sons, Scott and Aaron, and I have 2 nieces and a nephew. They have to continue telling their grandfather's story. It's not going to end with me.
No, and that's important. I'm glad that you brought that up, that it doesn't end with you. I feel like that's a common theme that I see within big tragedies like the Holocaust, such as like slavery. Like I think that a couple years back inside of sophomore we read Frederick Douglass's book. And, that's the interesting thing about being able to know these stories and recant these stories, is that it stays such a fabric in time and such a fabric in history.
I just want to tell you that my father went on. He went from working in a deli, sweeping floors, to owning a deli. We ended up moving to Ohio because Herb, his best friend, my uncle, his wife died at 32 of cancer, and there were 2 kids. And my father said, I have to go help him, because he was just devastated. He was the only one in Ohio. We were all in Boston. And my dad came here. And he didn't want to be in the restaurant business again, but he ended up in it, and it just about killed him. And my dad was always wheeling and dealing. So he started buying used restaurant equipment because he knew restaurant equipment. And the whole garage was full of restaurant equipment. And then all of a sudden on like Leonard and St. Clair, he's in a building. And he's got this used restaurant equipment. And it looked like a bunch of junk to me, to be honest. But the junk put my brother and I through college. And then he bought a building on West Broad in Franklinton. And then he outgrew that building, so he had to buy another building to put more of his junk in. And then people drove by and they saw this place called Restaurant Equippers. And they were selling new restaurant equipment to like other dealers. And they stopped in and they looked at this guy with, and his wife that are in there, and as I call it, the junk. And they said, okay, do you want to buy some new stoves? So my dad goes, yeah, I want to buy new stoves. I want to sell Vulcan stoves. He orders 25. So the rep says to me later, I met the rep later because I was still nursing then. And he said, I looked at this old foreigner and I thought, this guy's crazy. He's going to go broke with 25 stoves. So my dad brings in 25 stoves, and another guy comes in and he buys 200 stack chairs. My dad calls the stove guy back 10 days later, and says, I need to order 50 stoves. Okay? So everybody's now calling on my dad. Well, then he's outgrown both of those buildings, and he buys a building at 635 West Broad, which is by COSI. And it's 4 floors and a basement. And my mother goes, you will never fill this place up, and we're going to go broke, this mortgage, and this is insane. So in 2 months, the whole place was filled up, top to bottom. He had to buy another building behind. He still had the 2 down the street. Okay. Then he started, my brother and I came in. Then he started hiring salespeople. Then he said to Larry and I, you run the place. Then we kept getting bigger. Then we bought a distribution center, so we didn't have to warehouse everything on premises. We had that much stuff. And then we outgrew that. And then we broke ground on a new distribution center by Rickenbacker. And my dad broke ground and he passed away 2 weeks later. But he knew what was coming. And we now have locations in Columbus. We have our distribution center. We're in Philadelphia. We're in Detroit. And we're going to Charlotte. So this is what my dad, with no education, okay? You listen to me now. No education. The School of Hard Knocks, they called it. People said, what's he going to do? He's stupid. You know, he's going to sweep floors. This is what he did. This is what he did for me, for my brother. We run the business and we get along beautifully. We lost my mother 3 years ago this month. She worked with us every day until she passed at 95. She did great. And this is what he did. And it put us through college. We both went to college. We have 5 children that are all college educated because of my dad, because of the guy from Poland who came here, who couldn't speak a word of English and could do nothing more than sweep floors. My dad got a real estate broker's license. You know, the guy with the accent. Yeah, he was a real estate broker also. So you have to get an education. That was the most, to him, there was nothing more important than Larry and I got educated, and he lived to see all 5 kids born, not grow up, but that they got educated. And this is how you go forward in this world. I mean, he was lucky. He had nothing. He had no education. He always read. He was a history buff. He read everything. He watched TV. He watched the news. I mean, he couldn't soak up enough. He would have been a Harvard student, my daddy. He would have definitely been a Harvard student. The guy was brilliant. He just had a knack. And to this day, every day somebody comes into our business, oh, we miss your dad so much. What a man. So that's the legacy you leave. So get your educations, whether it be a trade, whether it be a lawyer, or a nurse like me.
And what a legacy that is. That's so awesome. I was actually reading up on your father and your legacy on Jewish Columbus, and hearing about how you talked about how you guys struggled during the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns, and how you feel like, you know, you guys have had employees that stick with you guys for 20 to 25 to 28 years. And I think it's awesome. I'm glad that you're able to talk about the company that you're vice president of, which is Restaurant Equippers, right?
Right.
Yes. So,
35 West Broad Street. Come say hi.
I will do that for sure. I want to thank you for spending your time with us today, and I'm going to let Alonga close us out.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Mr. Sugar.
You're all fabulous.
For just being here
in person and
and just reminding us how lucky we are to live better lives than the people from way back, and just to appreciate everything that we have that other people didn't have. And so it's always important to learn the history of people around the world, to educate ourselves, so we have at least a deeper understanding of what people went through and how we are very lucky. I'm going to use the word lucky very much. But that will be all for today's podcast. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and everyone for listening. And we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
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 Mr. Corrigan here again. On behalf of everyone at Cristo Rey, I want to personally thank Mrs. Sugarman for taking the time to speak to our students, and to Jewish Columbus, who helped make this interview possible. Cristo Rey Columbus's friendship with Jewish Columbus is a very special one for us. In honor of our Jewish brothers and sisters, the Cristo Rey Choir has prepared a performance of Ashivenu, an Israeli folk song in the Hebrew language. The lyrics come from chapter 5, verse 21 of the Book of Lamentations, and translate as, "Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old." Before they begin, podcast hosts Rebecca and Jade will close us in prayer.
Fully compassionate God on high,
To our 6 million brothers and sisters,
murdered because they were Jewish,
grant clear and certain rest with you,
in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure,
whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven.
source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings.
Secure their souls in eternity.
Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace.
Amen.
She